Hello and welcome to another podcast of Father and Joe. I am Joe Rocky, here with Father Boniface Hicks. And Father, we did our last podcast discussing Mary, Mother of God, and one of the things that we brought up there was her decision to say yes to God. And I'd like to use, obviously, part of this podcast is to grow people to get closer to God, but I'd like to specifically talk about that when God is reaching out to you, how he reaches out to you, and how to be open and receptive to know what he wants to go out and do it. Because I think that there's a lot of people who say that they're willing to go out and do stuff, but they don't know what they're supposed to be doing. Um, and I think that that would be a good topic to address here, would be how to discern what is the message of God and how to make yourself more open to hearing it more often and then being ultimately able to go and carry out whatever the request is. Because just as we ask God in our prayers, it's a two-way street, and there are callings of us to do to perform here on earth. So, like I said, that would be the starting point of today's cast, and go from there.
Yeah, it's a kind of thing that you and I have circled around to in different forms, a few different times.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like even one of our first casts, we were touching on this point, and I think it's appropriate because it's a question that comes up in our lives, and hopefully a question that should come up in our lives. It's probably a sign of where you are in your faith, Joe, that you're asking that question, and I mean that in a good way, that you don't feel like you sort of exhausted the whole relationship with God because you go to Mass on Sunday. You recognize that there's a lot more to it than that. That's just a kind of launching point. And the more happens every day. How do I live out the will of God every day? How do I work with God every day? And so it's wonderful that you asked that question, and I think a question that our listeners are interested in. And so it's closer to us than we realize, on our lips and in our hearts, and really is a part of our everyday. And the starting point is just our daily duty, that living out the responsibilities that we have. And if you're a married person, that's a responsibility to your spouse and your children. That's a responsibility just to carry out what's necessary to put food on the table, or to take care of the children, to make sure that they're warm and well fed. Just living out our daily duty is the starting point. If you're employed, then obviously doing what you're supposed to do for your job is a starting point. A lot of times we don't think about that as being God's will. That just seems very kind of earthly and uh, human, mundane, and not very interesting. But it is God's will. God is willing for us in our vocation, in marriage, or for me, priesthood and religious life, for single people, uh, willing for us in our occupation and our job to carry out the responsibility of those positions. And so that's the starting point, is our duty. How do I do God's will? Well, by doing my duty better. And that's why, cutting corners on our job or cutting corners on our family life is not just bad practice, or not just bad if we get caught. It's sin. It's going against the will of God. When we knowingly cheat our family, when we knowingly cheat our job, when we knowingly dispense of our responsibility, it's sin. We're also going against the will of God. So all of those things are tied together, again, as a starting point. And then we're going to have extraordinary experiences of all that, and those come up in a variety of different ways. Maybe you're driving to work, which is your responsibility. It's what you ought to be doing. And then there's an accident. Maybe you're in the accident. Maybe the accident occurred 2 cars up. Now you have this extraordinary circumstance. What are you going to do? Well, again, we need to always, we know that the moral law is always part of it. So jumping out of my car and attacking the guy who hit me from behind is clearly not God's will.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we might be frustrated and fearful and whatever else. These things, have a way of emerging from us at different times. But it's not God's will. Is insofar as we have the freedom to respond reasonably, then we need to respond reasonably to what's happening there. And then, we can be open. There are amazing things that can unfold in those circumstances where maybe the person that hit us is even more traumatized than we are, and there's a chance to even to minister to that person in a way. I know I was driving, somebody was following me, and I pulled out and crossed a street. I was at a stop sign and then crossed a busy street, and then the person behind me just followed me a little too closely and didn't realize there was a car coming, and pulled out and then got hit. And now there were a couple things happening. The person who did the hitting was actually driving too fast, but the person who was following me didn't stop long enough at the stop sign to yield to the traffic that was coming. Well, the consequence of it was, nobody was seriously hurt. There was damage done to the cars, but the woman that was driving was really shaken up by it, and she was shaken up by other things, which is part of the reason she was speeding. Mm-hmm. And the person following me was a psychologist. And after they worked out, the payments and the insurance and all of that kind of stuff, he ended up ministering to her. Now, she came into his life in a quite extraordinary way. Mm-hmm. But that's where we're open to God has a way of orchestrating things and bringing us into people's lives and activating relationships and the use of gifts for each other, and a lot of wonderful things can unfold if we're open to it. Now, if my friend had just been shut down and said, that terrible woman, she hit me, she's a terrible driver, I don't want to deal with her life, those are the things that close God's will out of our heart. But the more that we can be transformed by his grace and open to the surprising things that he does for us, then the more that we can carry out a ministry for people, and wonderful things can unfold. How many times have people met their spouses that way, or maybe not through a car accident, although I'm sure that's happened, mm-hmm. But through kind of accidental encounters, and that's where we need to be sort of tuned in the midst of the fabric of God's will in our lives is the daily duty, and that's what Mary was doing. She was carrying out her daily duty. We don't know exactly what she was doing, but we know that she was doing something with, maybe she was praying, maybe she was sweeping the floor, God only knows. But she was carrying out her daily duty, and in the midst of that, God broke in an extraordinary way. The Archangel Gabriel showed up to her, and God announced to her an extraordinary mission, not something that she had expected, but as she looks back, she could see that she was also prepared for it. And that's the amazing thing, too. God is preparing us right now for the mission that he is going to give us maybe 10 years from now. It's amazing to see the ways that he forms skills in us, that he introduces us to people, that he makes connections for us, that all of these things we're not even aware of. And suddenly that mission gets started up, and I realize I've got all the skills for this already. Mm-hmm. And that's how, so just kind of going about our lives in a way that's attentive, in a way that's ready for God to break in a way that's faithful to our daily duty, always opening in prayer, asking the Lord, trying to be ready. Is there, because if our hearts are closed to something, if I say there's no way I would ever do blank, I can really shut that down in my heart and not be open to God drawing me in that direction. So I don't want to close my heart in that way. I want to be open to what God may be leading me to. But then it's just a matter of carrying out our daily duty, doing it faithfully, doing it virtuously, doing it with love, doing it the best we can, and then God's will kind of unfolds.
Yeah, and that makes a whole lot of sense. So off of that, yeah, this is something that you're right. We have circled around it a couple of times in the past as going through some of our cast, and I think the part of it is that it's always good to try to bring up, but as we just can talk about the same topic multiple times and have way different ways of explaining it and get to different points. So one of the things that you brought up there in your analogy of the car accident was something that I think that we as people only see with negative things in our life, meaning that you have a lot of emotion inside of you and it's building up in a negative way. So now you're driving faster, you're not paying attention as much, you're much more likely to have something bad happen when you're already in a state of heightened negative emotion. Just the way it is, whether you're in sadness or anger, put those in the same category. When you're experiencing a lot of that, you're way more likely to have something such as a car accident happen, such as a problem at work or something or the other. And I also tend to think that the opposite is true. That if you're having, I'm not totally sure what the two driving emotions behind them, with like sadness and anger, probably thankfulness and something else, thankfulness and joy, that will lead to bigger and better things spurring along. Because I've seen that myself in life, and I've seen it with other people. Um, and I wanted to see if there's anything to that core concept going off your analogy, and how ultimately it can lead to where we're going here.
Yeah, well, insofar as we have some opportunity to choose what approach we're going to take, not everybody who is experiencing sadness and anger can just kind of like flip it off and turn
Sure.
on thankfulness and joy,
Sure, yeah.
but insofar as we are able to choose, and our thinking does make a big difference in what we're feeling. Uh, it's I like St. Thomas Aquinas has this great line. He says, "The intellect does not rule over the emotions like a master over a slave, but rather like a noble ruler over free citizens."
Hmm.
And our emotions have that quality of being kind of free citizens. They have a little bit of a mind of their own, but our mind, insofar as we can direct our thoughts and we can choose to think of more positive things and we can take a more positive approach and we can make acts of faith and acts of hope, well, it does make a difference on our emotions, and that makes a difference on our openness, that we can be more ready to respond to extraordinary circumstances or extraordinary interventions by God when we are thankful, when we are joyful, when we are hopeful, when we are have that kind of freedom, that interior freedom that goes together with those different emotions. So, insofar as we can choose to think about things that are going to lead us, but to keep our hearts open, we'll be able to respond better to those spontaneous experiences, those extraordinary interventions that we experience really every day. There are different points, unexpected things that happen, little surprises. God is the God of surprises. He likes working through surprises. So keeping our hearts open makes a big difference, to be ready to respond to those surprises in a positive way, to find God in the midst of those different experiences.
Yeah, and I like that what you just said there, that you can't control your emotions obviously all the way through. There's part of them that are just going to be reactionary, but the reactions are two things: your pre built-in desire of what should happen, and then what caused the reaction in the first place. So if you're coming from a state of being super aggressive and continuously angry, and you get rear-ended, you're much more likely to come out, guns a-blazing if someone rear-ends you. Whereas if you're constantly, praying and putting yourself in a state of peace and thankfulness, you're more likely to see that maybe this guy wasn't trying to rear-end me and he messed up, had no desire to do it, just as I had no desire to get rear-ended. And not to make everyone's out to get me type mindset, which I think is a really big poison on the mind. But that might not be um, exactly relevant to this cast, or maybe it's completely relevant. I'm not totally sure um, as we're going around here.
Yeah, and again, we just don't always have control over all of that. Um, our some of the emotional structures, even when you think of the kind of chemical things, I mean, hormones, play a role in this. Our lady listeners, our female listeners, know that in a particular way. They've got a lot of hormonal things that fluctuate in different ways throughout the course of a month,
Hmm.
which is part of the beauty of femininity and part of the cross that they bear, that they feel very intensely, and they sometimes feel things that just like don't make sense. And and we men have our own uh, variant of that, not quite so strongly affected by the hormonal dimensions, but just different things that are happening in the day, just tiredness. We take different drugs like caffeine or sugar in its own ways, and that affects us. It affects our emotions too. And then we're, by disposition, some people are just a little more melancholic. Some people are a little more naturally sanguine, joyful. Some people are a little more prone to anger. Some people a little more prone to um, just just being kind of placid and less emotional. So some of that is temperamental as well, and it goes back to, you can see it in babies. Babies already exhibit this coming out of the womb practically. So there's something that's more inherent in our humanity. But the point is, as much as we can take positive steps, have positive thoughts, ask for prayers, trust in others, build up our relationships, handle our own wounds, seek the healing that we need. A lot of steps that we can take to have a more positive emotional disposition, and thus be more ready to handle those extraordinary interventions when God shows up in our day in unexpected ways. And those can be exciting moments, they can be fearful moments, but as we have an attitude that God is on our side and he's not having these interventions, he's not bringing up these extraordinary things in order to uh, punish us or uh, be cruel to us, or be just throw us under the bus somehow. But he always brings these things up ultimately for our good and for the good of the church and the whole world. And the more we can be ready to respond with our heart and mind and soul and strength, then the more effectively we can carry out his will in our lives, and people will be blessed by that.
Yeah, and, and and obviously you can't control your disposition, can't control a lot of the chemistry part of what's going on inside of you. To the barring what you eat, obviously you can control what chemicals you're putting into your
Mm-hmm.
body, but a lot of it is just kind of the cards you were dealt, if you will. And you know, obviously one of the driving forces of all of this is to put your faith in God to teach you how to play your hand as best as you can. And you know, is there any specific things that people can do to make themselves more open to basically learn how Jesus is telling you how to play your cards, how to do it? Any specific prayers or thoughts that people can integrate into their lives to help them make the steps in the right direction?
Yeah, that's a great question, and absolutely. The fundamental thing is prayer. If we have a relationship with God, if we really know Him personally, which only ultimately comes through prayer, then we're ready to encounter Him, to meet Him, to work with Him, to be with Him, in the midst of the kind of circumstances that come up in our lives. So we're always going to be better disposed if we're praying. And then a particular way to pray is a kind of prayer of surrender. That it's what we do in the Our Father. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Now, I have some stipulations about what I want that will to be. It would be nice to get my daily bread today. And it would be nice if I could also forgive and be forgiven. And it would be nice if you didn't let the evil one have the last word, but that you would deliver me from him and not test me too much. Don't make it too hard. Don't let me fall into temptation. And so the Our Father is a very beautiful way to pray. To pray the Our Father sincerely every day is a wonderful prayer of surrender, that we say, okay, Lord, I trust you. Whatever comes today, I want to correspond with your grace. I want to work with you. I trust you. And I have some needs. I know my own weakness. I know my physical needs, and I know my emotional needs, and I know my spiritual needs, and I know that there are things that are too much for me, and I need your help. But the Our Father is a beautiful way to pray. And there are other things. There's an Italian priest who he's a servant of God. He's not a saint yet, Father Dolindo, and he has something called the Novena of Surrender. I think that's what you could search for on Google, Novena of Surrender. And it's a very beautiful prayer. Trustful Surrender to Divine Providence is a beautiful book that you can find free online. It was written by Saint Claude de la Colombière back several hundred years ago, and is a wonderful reflection on that call to surrender, that God is at work in all of the events of our lives, and that we can become more sensitive and more responsive to that. So a lot of different ways to pray, but maybe the most fundamental is just the Our Father, and even more simply than that, just to say to Jesus in our hearts, Jesus, I trust in you, and I trust in your will in my life, and I want to carry that will out today. I want to be open to that. And that is a way of getting our hearts in the right disposition towards God so that we can really carry out his will most effectively in our lives.
Well, that's a beautiful way to end today's cast, and something that we hope that everyone out there will carry forward in their weeks to come, and even beyond that. So again, we thank everyone for listening. Please continue to tell a friend around you and keep giving us the reviews that you have been. We look forward to speaking with you next week. Thank you.